The mess hall of the Valiant Dawn hummed with the usual cacophony of a dozen different species sharing their evening meal. Chittering, growling, and melodic tones mixed together in the universal language of soldiers unwinding after another brutal day of war against the Devourers. Steam rose from various bowls containing sustenance suited to each species' biological needs, creating a haze that softened the harsh lighting of the military vessel. At the center table sat Commander HFY, his four arms methodically working through his nutrient paste while his compound eyes scanned the room. The Kytherian was a legend among the Galactic Defense Force, a warrior who had survived more battles against the Devourer swarms than any other living being. His chitinous exoskeleton bore the scars of countless encounters, each mark telling a story of survival against impossible odds. Young Lieutenant Vexera approached hesitantly, her tentacles curled in the respectful pose of her aquatic species. The Neridian had only recently graduated from the academy and had heard whispers about the commander's incredible exploits. Behind her, a small group of junior officers from various species followed, their expressions mixing curiosity with awe. Commander HFY, Vexera's voice bubbled through her translation device. We were wondering if you might share some stories from your campaigns. We've heard remarkable things about your service record. The veteran's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. His primary eyes focused on the young officers while his secondary eyes continued monitoring the room, a habit that had kept him alive for decades. Stories, you say? What kind of stories interest fresh academy graduates? A Vulcan officer, his rocky skin glowing faintly with excitement, stepped forward. We've heard you fought alongside many species, sir. The most exotic warriors the galaxy has to offer. Perhaps you could tell us about the most fearsome allies you've encountered? HFY's antennae twitched, and he set down his eating utensil. The conversation around nearby tables began to quiet as other veterans sensed the shift in atmosphere. Those who had served long enough knew that when HFY told stories, they were worth hearing. Fearsome allies, he repeated slowly, his voice carrying the weight of memory. I have fought alongside the crystalline warriors of Zirian Prime, beings who could shatter mountains with their resonance attacks. I've stood beside the flame-wreathed Pyrothians as they turned entire battlefields into infernos. I've watched the shadow dancers of the Umbral Collective phase through solid matter to strike at Devourer hearts. The young officers leaned closer, their eyes wide with anticipation. Around them, other conversations had completely stopped as more soldiers gathered to listen. But you ask about the most fearsome, HFY continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The most terrifying warriors I have ever had the honor and nightmare of fighting alongside were not exotic at all. They came from a small blue world on the outer rim of the galaxy, a species so unremarkable that most civilizations dismissed them as primitive when they first achieved spaceflight. A Centaurian engineer, his metallic implants gleaming, spoke up from the gathering crowd. You mean the humans? But, Commander, they only joined the war 3 cycles ago. Surely they haven't had time to prove themselves against opponents like the Crystal Warriors or the Flame Wreath. HFY's compound eyes fixed on the engineer with an intensity that made the Centaurian's cooling vents automatically activate. 3 cycles, he repeated. In 3 cycles, the humans went from being unknown primitives to the most requested allies in any major offensive. Do you know why? The mess hall had become completely silent except for the hum of life support systems. Even the veteran soldiers were listening intently now, many nodding as memories of their own encounters with human forces played through their minds. I first encountered humans during the Battle of Kepler Station. HFY began, his 4 arms gesturing as he spoke. The Devourers had overrun the outer defenses, and we were trapped in the central complex with no hope of evacuation. Our ammunition was running low, our wounded were dying, and the enemy was preparing for their final assault. That's when the humans arrived. He paused, reaching for his drink with one hand while his others remained perfectly still, a sign that even years later, the memory affected him deeply. They came in ships that looked like they'd been assembled from scrap metal. No elegant curves like Alarian vessels. No crystalline perfection like Xerian craft. Just angular, brutal efficiency. When they landed in the station's docking bay, I expected perhaps 100 reinforcements. Instead, only 12 humans emerged from their transport. A young Trilaxian medic couldn't contain her curiosity. 12? Against how many devourers? Conservative estimates put the enemy force at over 3,000. HFY replied matter-of-factly. The devourer swarm had been building for weeks, consuming everything in their path. 3,000 of the galaxy's most efficient killing machines, each one capable of tearing through battle armor with their bare claws. The silence stretched as everyone tried to process the impossible odds. Finally, Lieutenant Vexera asked the question they were all thinking. What happened? HFY's mandibles clicked rapidly, the Kytherian equivalent of nervous laughter. I walked up to their leader, a human female named Captain Sarah Chun. She was shorter than me, which at the time I found almost insulting. No natural armor, no claws, no enhanced physiology that I could detect. She was examining what appeared to be a primitive projectile weapon, and when she looked up at me, I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. What? Several voices asked in unison. Joy, HFY said simply. Not determination, not duty, not even courage. Pure, terrifying joy, like she had just received the most wonderful gift imaginable. I told her about our situation. 3,000 devourers, limited ammunition, no evacuation possible. Do you know what she said? The audience waited with bated breath. She smiled. Humans bare their teeth when pleased, a gesture that should indicate aggression, but somehow doesn't, and said, Only 3,000? We were hoping for more. Boys, looks like we'll have to share. A Vulcan engineer's internal temperature spiked involuntarily. Share what? The killing, HFY replied, his voice barely audible now. They were disappointed that there weren't more enemies to fight. I thought perhaps their translation devices were malfunctioning, so I had my technical officer run a diagnostic. The translation was perfect. They were genuinely upset that the odds were only 250 to 1 against them. He took a long drink before continuing, and several of the listeners found themselves leaning forward unconsciously. Captain Shin asked me to show her the tactical display. When she saw the devourer positions, she made a sound that their species calls whistling, a strange noise that indicates appreciation. Then, she turned to her 11 companions and said something that still gives me nightmares. What did she say? Vexera whispered, Gentlemen, ladies, we have a target-rich environment. Rules of engagement are weapons-free, collateral damage is not a concern, and the coffee runs out in 6 hours. Let's make this quick. HFY set down his drink with hands that trembled slightly. I had no idea what coffee was at the time, but the way she said it made it clear that running out would be catastrophic. I learned later that it's a mild stimulant beverage. The fact that they were more concerned about their drink supplies than facing odds of 250 to 1 should have been my first warning about what I was dealing with. A veteran Altarian sergeant who had been listening from a nearby table called out, Commander, we've all heard rumors about human combat effectiveness, but surely you're exaggerating the numbers? HFY's 4 eyes focused on the sergeant with laser intensity. Sergeant, I have the battle recordings in my personal files. The station's security systems captured everything. If you think I'm exaggerating, you're welcome to review them, though I should warn you that most species find the footage disturbing. The Altarian's head tendrils curled defensively. Disturbing how? Because watching humans fight isn't like watching any other species engage in combat. When a Kytherian warrior fights, we use our natural advantages, speed, multiple limbs, compound vision. When a Perothian fights, they channel their internal flames. When your people fight, Sergeant, you use your superior strength and resilience. Combat for most species is about applying our natural gifts efficiently. HFY paused, his antennae twitching as if trying to process the memory properly. Humans don't have any significant natural advantages. No claus, no armor, no energy projectile, no enhance de fisiologia. So they do something that no other species does. They improvise. And their improvisation is creative in ways that defy rational thought. The mess hall was so quiet that the ventilation system sounded like a roaring wind. Several of the younger officers had unconsciously moved closer together, as if seeking comfort in numbers. The first thing Captain Shin did was ask if we had any cleaning supplies, HFY continued. Specifically, she wanted to know if we had anything that was flammable, corrosive, or explosive. I told her about the industrial solvent we used for equipment maintenance. She examined it and smiled that terrifying smile again. What was she planning? Asked a hegemony communications officer, his crystalline voice harmony echoing with nervous undertones. I had no idea at the time, but I was about to learn something about humans that still keeps me awake during sleep cycles. They don't just use weapons, they turn everything into weapons. Captain Chun took that industrial solvent and combined it with components for broken equipment, some nutrition paste, and what she called basic chemistry to create explosives that were more effective than our military-grade charges. HFY's secondary eyes scanned the crowd, noting their expressions of disbelief and growing unease. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was that she did this in about 15 minutes, while simultaneously developing a battle plan that turned our desperate last stand into an offensive operation. She looked at a tactical situation that would have required months of planning and preparation for any normal military force, and she redesigned it on the spot. A young draconian cadet, his scales shifting colors with emotion, spoke up. Surely the other humans weren't all as capable as their captain? HFY's mandibles clicked in that nervous laugh again. Oh, they were worse. Captain Chun was the careful, methodical one. Her second-in-command, a human male named Lieutenant Murphy, took one look at the devourer positions and asked if anyone had duct tape. What's duct tape? Several voices asked simultaneously. It's a primitive adhesive material that humans use for temporary repairs, HFY explained. Lieutenant Murphy took this repair tape, combined it with some power cells and a few other components I couldn't identify, and created what he called claymore mines. When I asked him what they were designed to do, he said they were meant to turn devourers into chunky salsa. The translator devices around the room struggled with the phrase chunky salsa, producing a variety of confused sounds as they tried to render the concept into various alien languages. I didn't understand the reference at the time, HFY continued, but after the battle, I researched human food preparation. Chunky salsa is apparently a food condiment made of small, roughly chopped pieces mixed with liquid. The implication of what Lieutenant Murphy intended to do to the devourers with his improvised weapons was visceral. Several of the younger officers made involuntary sounds of distress, and a few had their species' equivalent of going pale. The actual assault began 12 minutes after the humans arrived, HFY said, his voice taking on the mechanical tone of someone recounting a trauma. Captain Shin divided her team into 3 groups of 4. The first group, led by herself, would create a distraction at the main entrance. The second group would infiltrate through the ventilation system. The third group, under Lieutenant Murphy, would approach from what she called the stupid direction. What's the stupid direction? Lieutenant Vexera asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. According to human military doctrine, it's the direction that's so obviously suicidal that no sane commander would attack from there, which means it's the last direction the enemy expects, HFY explained. In this case, it meant going through the exterior hull of the station, across open space, with no environmental protection except their basic combat suits. The mess hall erupted in gasps and exclamations of disbelief. Moving across open space during a battle without proper environmental gear was considered impossible even for the hardiest species. The Devourers were expecting a conventional last stand, defenders barricaded in fortified positions, trading fire until ammunition ran out. They were not expecting Captain Chun to kick down the main door, throw homemade explosives into their formations, and then charge directly into their midst while screaming what I later learned was a human war cry. What was the war cry? Asked the Centaurian engineer, his voice barely functioning through his translator. Zephi paused, his compound eyes focusing on something far away. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of awe mixed with terror. "Leroy Jenkins," he bellowed suddenly, causing half the mess hall to jump backwards in alarm. She screamed it at the top of her lungs while running directly into a formation of 50 devourers armed with nothing but a projectile weapon and a knife. A knife, mind you, that was approximately 6 inches long, facing creatures with 10-inch claws and personal shields. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several species equivalent of hyperventilation. Did she survive? Buxada whispereth. Zephi's antennae twitched. Survive? She killed 17 devourers in close combat before her backup arrived. 17, with a 6-inch blade and what she later described as aggressive problem-solving skills. When Lieutenant Murphy's group reached her position, they found her using a devourer corpse as a club to beat other devourers to death. The young Trilaxian medic made a sound like a squeaky toy being stepped on. That's impossible. Devourer exoskeletons are harder than most military-grade armor. That's what I thought too, Zephi agreed. So I asked Captain Chun how she managed to penetrate their natural defenses. She looked at me like I was being slow and said, "Everything has weak points. You just have to be creative about finding them." Then she showed me 17 different ways to kill a devourer using nothing but standard items you can find in any military facility. He paused to take another drink, and his hands were definitely shaking now. The demonstration took 43 minutes and left me with recurring nightmares about the creative potential of coat hangers, meal trays, and what humans call aggressive percussion maintenance applied to living creatures. The mess hall had become a study in horrified fascination. Every being present was simultaneously repulsed and unable to stop listening. Meanwhile, the group that went through the ventilation system had been busy turning the station's own infrastructure into a weapon. When the devourers tried to retreat from Captain Chin's assault, they found that every major corridor had been converted into what the humans called kill zones using nothing but maintenance equipment and creative engineering. How? Several voices asked weakly. Electrified floor panels powered by rerouted lighting systems. Ceiling panels rigged to drop industrial equipment on anyone passing underneath. Doorways that had been converted into crushing mechanisms using hydraulic systems meant for cargo handling. The humans turned an entire space station into a complex death trap in the time it took me to finish explaining our tactical situation to Captain Chin. Zephi's 4 arms spread in a gesture of bewildered amazement. But Lieutenant Murphy's group achieved something that I still don't entirely believe, even though I witnessed it personally. They approached across open space by using emergency thruster packs to propel themselves like missiles directly through the station's outer windows. Not through airlocks or docking ports, through windows. They calculated the trajectory needed to break through the transparent aluminum barriers and land inside the Devourer Command Center while the entire enemy force was focused on repelling Captain Chin's frontal assault. A hegemony tactical officer, his crystalline form resonating with stress harmonics, managed to ask, how did they survive decompression? They didn't just survive it, Zephi replied, his voice filled with the kind of usually reserved for religious experiences. They weaponized it. Lieutenant Murphy's team deliberately created hull breaches to use explosive decompression as a crowd control measure. They turned the station's life support systems into tactical advantages. The mess hall was now filled with the sounds of various species expressing extreme distress in their native languages. Chittering, growling, harmonic discord, and bubbling that spoke of deep psychological disturbancy. The battle lasted exactly 37 minutes from the time Captain Chin kicked down the first door until Lieutenant Murphy reported that all devourers had been neutralized. Zephi continued relentlessly. 37 minutes. 3,000 devourers eliminated by 12 humans using improvised weapons and what they called applied creativity. He set down his drink and looked around at the assembled crowd, his compound eyes taking in their expressions of shock, disbelief, and growing fear. When it was over, Captain Shin walked up to me, still covered in devourer fluid and carrying what appeared to be an improvised flamethrower made from cleaning supplies and a food preparation device. She looked at the tactical display showing 0 enemy contacts remaining and said, "Well, that was fun. Got anything stronger to fight next time?" The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before a veteran Altarian sergeant found his voice. "Commander, surely this was an exceptional unit? Elite Special Forces, perhaps?" Zephi's mandibles clicked rapidly, and for the first time since he'd begun speaking, there was something that might have been humor in his voice. "That's what I thought too, Sergeant. So I accessed their service records." Captain Sarah Chun had been a civilian structural engineer 6 months before joining the military. Lieutenant Murphy had been what humans call a high school chemistry teacher, apparently someone who educates their young in basic scientific principles. The rest of the team included a carpenter, a mechanic, 2 students, a chef, a librarian, a janitor, a taxi driver, and someone whose job was described as professional video game player. The mess hall erupted in chaos as every being present began talking at once, their voices mixing into a cacophony of disbelief, fear, and urgent questions. Zephi waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "Civilians," he repeated when he could be heard again. "Ordinary humans with ordinary jobs who had volunteered for military service when their world joined the war effort. No special training, no genetic enhancement, no cybernetic implants. Just regular people who had been given basic military equipment and told to go help the galaxy." A young draconian cadet, his scales now cycling through colors so rapidly they created a prismatic effect, stammered out a question. "But surely their weapons were advanced? Some new technology we hadn't seen before." Zephi reached into his equipment pouch and pulled out a small device that he placed on the table. Several of the nearest officers leaned forward to examine it. "This is what Captain Chun called her primary sidearm," he said. "It's essentially a small metal tube that uses controlled explosions to propel pieces of lead at high velocity. No energy cells, no quantum fields, no exotic matter. Just chemistry, physics, and precision engineering that most of our civilizations developed and abandoned thousands of years ago as primitive." The device looked almost comically simple compared to the advanced energy weapons carried by modern military forces. Several of the engineers in the crowd moved closer to examine it, their expressions growing more confused as they realized how basic the technology was. With this primitive weapon, Captain Chun eliminated 43 devourers in direct combat, Zephi continued. "Not through superior technology, but through superior application of basic principles and what she called good target selection. When I asked her to explain her marksmanship techniques, she said she had learned them by shooting cans in her backyard for fun." The crowd was now displaying every species' equivalent of existential crisis. The idea that such devastating combat effectiveness could come from recreational activities was challenging their fundamental understanding of warfare. "I requested permission to observe human forces in subsequent operations," Zephi said. "What I learned over the following months redefined my understanding of what warfare could be. Humans don't just fight battles. They turn battles into engineering problems and solve them with whatever materials happen to be available." He gestured around the mess hall with all 4 arms. "Every species here understands combat as the application of specific tools and techniques designed for warfare. Humans understand combat as the creative application of everything that exists for whatever purpose happens to be most effective. They don't see a distinction between military equipment and civilian supplies. They see only resources that can be repurposed for tactical advantage." Lieutenant Vexera, her tentacles curled tightly with anxiety, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Commander, are you saying that humans are more dangerous than any other species in the galaxy?" Zephi considered the question carefully, his antennae twitching as he processed the implications of his answer. "No, Lieutenant," he said finally. "I'm saying that humans are more dangerous than any other species in the galaxy has ever imagined it was possible to be. And The most terrifying part is that they don't consider themselves particularly dangerous. What I've described to you, the improvisation, the creative problem-solving, the ability to turn anything into a weapon, humans consider this normal behavior. They call it making do or getting creative and act like every species should be able to do the same thing. The mess hall had become a temple of horrified silence. Even the veteran soldiers who had thought they understood the nature of warfare were staring at HFY with new appreciation for the forces they were allied with. "I have two more stories to tell you," HFY said, his voice carrying a note of grim determination. "Stories that will help you understand why every major military operation now specifically requests human support, and why the Devourers have begun retreating from systems the moment they detect human ships approaching." He looked around at the assembled crowd, taking in their expressions of fascination and dread. "But first, I suggest you all finish your meals and perhaps request something stronger to drink. Because what I'm about to tell you about the siege of Proxima Station and the Battle of the Titans graveyard will make the events at Kepler Station seem like a routine training exercise." The mess hall erupted in a chaos of voices as beings demanded to know more, begged him to stop, or simply sat in stunned silence, contemplating the implications of what they had just heard. HFY calmly finished his nutrient paste, his compound eyes scanning the room with the satisfaction of a teacher who had successfully conveyed an important lesson. In the distance, the ship's communication system crackled to life with an announcement that made every being in the room freeze. "Attention, all personnel. We are approaching the Zirian system, where we will be joining the human fleet for Operation Starbreaker. All crew members are advised to review safety protocols and ensure their personal effects are properly secured." The implication was clear. They were about to witness human warfare firsthand. Around the mess hall, beings began quietly discussing whether their insurance policies covered what they were about to experience. The next evening, the mess hall of the Valiant Dawn was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout the ship about Commander HFY's stories, and beings who had never shown interest in war tales were now crowding around every available space. Some had brought recording devices, others had brought friends, and a few had brought what appeared to be anxiety medication. HFY arrived to find his usual table surrounded by an audience 3 times larger than the previous night. Among the crowd were several senior officers who had initially dismissed the stories as exaggerations, and at least one delegation from the ship's medical bay who seemed professionally concerned about the mental health implications of what they were about to hear. The Kytherian commander settled into his seat with practiced military precision, his 4 arms arranging his meal while his compound eyes assessed the expectant crowd. The mess hall fell silent except for the nervous clicking of mandibles, the soft bubbling of aquatic species, and the occasional harmonic resonance from crystalline beings trying to maintain emotional stability. "I see word has traveled," HFY observed, his antennae twitching with what might have been amusement. "Before I continue, I want to make something clear to the new faces in the audience. What I'm about to tell you is not fiction, entertainment, or propaganda. These are official after-action reports filed with Galactic Defense Command. Every incident I describe has been verified by multiple sources and documented with full sensor records." A senior hegemony officer, her crystalline form resonating with skeptical harmonies, spoke up. "Commander, with respect, some of us have reviewed the preliminary reports from human operations. While impressive, surely the accounts have been embellished through repeated telling." HFY's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound that the veterans in the room recognized as barely controlled laughter. "Major HFY, I appreciate your skepticism. It shows proper military thinking. However, I should point out that every report about human operations has been deliberately understated in official documents. Command decided that accurate reporting was having a negative impact on morale among non-human forces." The Major's harmonic resonance shifted to a frequency that indicated confusion. "Understated how?" "The official report of the Kepler Station incident states that human forces successfully neutralized enemy opposition using improvised tactics. It doesn't mention that they converted a civilian space station into a complex death trap in under an hour, or that their casualty report listed 0 dead, 0 wounded, and 1 human who required medical attention because he pulled a muscle while clubbing a devourer to death with another devourer. The mess hall erupted in a chaos of gasps, clicks, bubbles, and harmonic discord. Several beings made gestures that were the equivalent of covering their eyes, and at least one Trilaxian medic began rapidly updating what appear to be psychological trauma protocols. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the siege of Proxima Station. HFY continued once the noise had died down. This was the operation that convinced Galactic Command to completely revise their strategic doctrines and establish human liaison officers in every major military planning department. He paused to take a drink, noting that many of his audience members were doing the same, though their beverages appeared to be significantly stronger than standard military rations. Proxima Station was a fortress, HFY began. Not just a military installation, but a purpose-built defensive complex designed to withstand siege conditions for up to 5 years. It was located in a strategically crucial system that controlled access to 3 major trade routes and served as the headquarters for the 14th Fleet. The commander's secondary eyes scanned the crowd while his primary eyes focused on his memories. The Devourers had been besieging the station for 8 months when human forces arrived. 8 months of constant assault had reduced the garrison from 12,000 defenders to fewer than 3,000. Ammunition was critically low, food supplies were running out, and the station's defensive systems were operating at 30% efficiency. A young Centaurian engineer raised a mechanical appendage. "Sir, what was the Devourer force strength?" Conservative estimates placed their numbers at 50,000 combat units, plus support swarms. HFY replied matter-of-factly. They had established a complete blockade of the system and were systematically dismantling the station's outer defenses. Galactic Command had written off Proxima Station as a strategic loss and was preparing evacuation scenarios for the remaining civilian population. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of dread that comes from understanding impossible odds. Every military being in the room could visualize the tactical situation, and none of them could imagine a solution. The human force that responded to our distress call consisted of a single ship, HFY continued. Not a fleet, not a battle group. One ship. The U.S. Murphy's Law, commanded by Captain James Mad Jack Hartwell, a draconian tactical officer, her scales cycling through worried colors, interrupted. "Commander, forgive me, but one ship against 50,000 Devourers? That's not a rescue mission. That's suicide with extra steps." HFY's compound eyes focused on the tactical officer with laser intensity. "That's exactly what I said when I received their transmission." Captain Hartwell responded by asking if we had any specific requests for how we'd like the Devourers eliminated. When I explained that his single ship was outnumbered 50,000 to 1, he said, "Those are pretty good odds." We were worried this might be too easy. The mess hall filled with the sounds of various species expressing psychological distress. Several beings had begun what appeared to be religious rituals, and at least one hegemony officer was updating his will on a portable terminal. The Murphy's Law was what humans call a heavy cruiser, HFY continued. Compared to modern galactic warships, it was primitive. No exotic matter weapons, no quantum field generators, no dimensional phase capabilities. Just kinetic weapons, chemical explosives, and what the humans called nuclear devices, apparently weapons that work by splitting atoms apart violently. A Vulcan engineer's internal temperature spiked involuntarily. They weaponize atomic fission? That's barely controlled stellar physics. Indeed, HFY agreed. But, as I learned at Kepler Station, humans don't see limitations. They see creative opportunities. Captain Hartwell's approach to the siege was to ignore conventional tactical doctrine entirely, and instead ask a question that had never occurred to any of us. "What question?" several voices asked simultaneously. "What if we don't try to break the siege?" HFY said quietly. "What if we turn the siege into a trap?" The silence that followed was filled with the kind of anticipation that precedes either revelation or catastrophe. Captain Hartwell studied the Devourer positions for exactly 14 minutes before announcing his battle plan. HFY continued. He was going to use what he called aggressive asteroid mining techniques to turn the entire Proxima system into what he described as the galaxy's largest Claymore mine. The Centaurian engineers' cooling systems activated audibly. He was going to mine asteroids during an active siege. Not mine them, HFY corrected. Weaponize them. Captain Hartwell had noticed that the Proxima system contained an unusually dense asteroid field, which the Devourers were using as cover for their siege positions. His plan was to use nuclear devices to alter the orbital mechanics of selected asteroids, turning them into guided projectiles. Around the mess hall, beings were beginning to display their species' equivalent of existential crisis. The idea of using celestial mechanics as a weapon system was so fundamentally insane that their military training had no framework for processing it. But that wasn't the terrifying part, HFY continued relentlessly. The terrifying part was that Captain Hartwell calculated the orbital mechanics in his head while eating what humans call a sandwich and arguing with his chief engineer about the proper way to prepare something called coffee. He treated the mathematical complexities of multi-body gravitational interactions like a casual mental exercise. A hegemony mathematician, her crystalline form resonating with harmonic discord, managed to stammer out a question. Commander, orbital mechanics calculations for multiple large masses require quantum computers and weeks of processing time. How could any biological mind? That's what I asked Captain Hartwell. HFY interrupted. He looked at me like I was being slow and said it's just physics and trigonometry. We teach this stuff to our kids in high school. Then he handed me a napkin where he had sketched out the complete orbital modification plan, including timing sequences, required explosive yields, and predicted impact patterns. The mathematician's harmonic resonance shifted to a frequency that indicated complete mental shutdown. Several other beings in the crowd were beginning to show similar symptoms of cognitive overload. The operation began at 0800 station time. HFY continued. Captain Hartwell launched a series of what he called precision nuclear strikes against carefully selected asteroids throughout the system. To any external observer, it would have looked like random destruction, humans attacking rocks instead of enemy forces. He paused to take another drink, his four hands working independently to manage his meal while he spoke. The Devourers responded exactly as predicted. They interpreted the asteroid strikes as either panic or incompetence and pressed their attack on the station. For 6 hours, it seemed like Captain Hartwell had made a catastrophic mistake. The human ship was taking heavy fire, station defenses were failing, and the Devourer forces were preparing for their final assault. The tension in the mess hall was becoming physically uncomfortable. Several species were producing stress pheromones, and the air recycling system was working overtime to maintain atmospheric balance. At 1,400 hours, the first modified asteroid reached its target, HFY said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A 15-kilometer-wide chunk of nickel iron ore, traveling at 47 kilometers per second, impacted the main Devourer fleet formation. He set down his eating utensil and looked around at the assembled crowd. The explosion was visible from 17 star systems away. It completely vaporized 3,000 Devourer ships and created an expanding cloud of superheated plasma that destroyed another 2,000 vessels. In a single impact, Captain Hartwell had eliminated 40% of the enemy force using a weapon that technically didn't exist until 6 hours before he fired it. The mess hall had become a study in horrified silence. Even the veteran soldiers were staring at HFY with expressions that suggested their fundamental understanding of warfare had just been shattered. But the first impact was just the beginning. HFY continued mercilessly. Captain Hartwell had calculated a sequential cascade of asteroid impacts designed to create what he called overlapping fields of fire. Every 8 minutes for the next 2 hours, another modified asteroid reached its target. Each impact was precisely timed to catch Devourer forces as they tried to retreat from the previous explosion. A young Neridian officer, her tentacles curled so tightly they had cut off circulation, whispered, "How many impacts total?" 17. 17 asteroids, each one weighing between 10 and 25 million tons, each one traveling at relativistic speeds, each one guided by Captain Hartwell's calculations to arrive at exactly the right place and time to maximize damage to retreating enemy forces. The numbers were so large that several beings' translation devices simply gave up and started producing static. The idea of coordinating 17 separate relativistic projectiles with precision timing was beyond the computational capabilities of most military organizations. By 1600 hours, the entire Devourer siege force had been eliminated. HFY continued. Not defeated, not routed, completely annihilated. 50,000 combat units and their support swarms, destroyed by one human ship using improvised weapons made from naturally occurring celestial bodies. A veteran Altarian sergeant, his voice hoarse with disbelief, asked, "What were our casualties?" HFY's mandibles clicked in that nervous laugh that was becoming familiar to his audience. Proxima Station suffered 0 additional casualties. The Murphy's Law reported minor damage to their paint from debris impacts and requested permission to touch up the scratches before their next assignment. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several beings quietly updating their personal insurance policies on mobile terminals. But the most disturbing part of the entire operation, HFY said, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a particularly vivid nightmare, was Captain Hartwell's post-battle report. He filed a formal complaint with Galactic Command about the insufficient challenge level of the engagement and requested that future assignments include more interesting tactical problems. Around the mess hall, beings were beginning to display physical symptoms of stress that transcended species boundaries. Scales were changing color, tentacles were knotting themselves, crystalline forms were resonating at frequencies that suggested imminent structural failure, and at least one Vulcan engineer had activated his emergency cooling systems. I requested a meeting with Captain Hartwell after the battle, HFY continued. I wanted to understand how he had developed such an unconventional tactical approach. His explanation has haunted me ever since. What did he say? Lieutenant Vexera asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid to know. He told me that using asteroids as weapons was something called basic science fiction, HFY replied. According to Captain Hartwell, humans have been imagining this type of warfare for centuries through their entertainment media. He said that any human child who had read what they call space adventure books would have suggested the same strategy. The implications of this statement rippled through the crowd like a psychological shockwave. The idea that such devastating military innovation was considered children's entertainment was challenging their fundamental understanding of human culture. I asked him to recommend some of this entertainment media. HFY continued. Captain Hartwell gave me a data chip containing what he called basic sci-fi reading list for beginners. I spent the next 3 months reviewing the material and discovered something that still gives me nightmares. He paused to finish his drink, noting that many of his audience members were now consuming their beverages at an accelerated rate. The humans have spent centuries imagining increasingly creative ways to wage war, HFY said. Not just conventional warfare, but exotic conflict scenarios that push the boundaries of physics, logic, and sanity. They have entire genres of entertainment devoted to exploring what-if scenarios involving everything from biological warfare to time travel combat to weaponizing celestial mechanics. A draconian cultural anthropologist, her scales now cycling through colors so rapidly they created a strobing effect, managed to ask, "Are you saying that human military doctrine is based on their fiction?" "I'm saying that human military doctrine is limited by their fiction," HFY corrected, "and their fiction has no limits. I found stories about humans fighting wars with weapons made from black holes, conflicts involving the manipulation of fundamental physical constants, and battles conducted across multiple dimensions simultaneously. What Captain Hartwell did with those asteroids was considered a basic space combat maneuver according to their entertainment standards. The mess hall was now filled with the sounds of various species equivalent of hyperventilation. Several medical officers had begun quietly distributing what appeared to be emergency medications, and at least one being was updating their personal evacuation plans. After Proxima Station, I was assigned as a liaison officer to human forces, HFY continued. I spent 6 months embedded with their Third Fleet and learned things about warfare that challenged every assumption I had ever made about conflict strategy and the nature of violence itself. He looked around at his audience, taking in their expressions of fascinated horror. I witnessed humans turn supply convoys into weapons platforms, convert entertainment facilities into fortress complexes, and transform routine maintenance operations into tactical advantages. I watched them analyze enemy battle formations and develop countermeasures using nothing but observational data and what they called educated guesses. A Centaurian logistics officer, his mechanical components clicking nervously, asked, "How is that possible without advanced computational support?" "Because humans don't think like computers," HFY replied. "Computers process information according to predetermined algorithms. Humans process information through something they call intuition, a cognitive process that somehow combines incomplete data, experiential knowledge, and creative extrapolation to produce solutions that shouldn't mathematically be possible." The logistics officer's status lights began flashing in patterns that suggested critical system errors. "That's not how rational decision-making works." "Exactly," HFY agreed. "Human decision-making isn't rational. It's creative. They don't solve problems by following logical procedures. They solve problems by imagining solutions that don't exist and then making them exist through sheer stubborn determination and what they call thinking outside the box." Around the mess hall, beings were beginning to show signs of what could only be described as cognitive rebellion against the concepts they were being asked to process. During my time with the Third Fleet, I observed 17 major engagements, HFY continued. In every single case, the humans employed tactics that were either theoretically impossible, strategically insane, or both. They won every engagement with casualty rates so low that our military analysts initially assumed the reports were falsified. "How low?" asked the hegemony medical officer, her harmonic resonance suggesting professional curiosity mixed with dread. The Third Fleet conducted 17 major battles over 6 months and suffered a total of 43 injuries, 0 fatalities, and 1 incident that required psychological counseling, HFY replied. The psychological counseling was for a human soldier who was upset that he didn't get to see any real action during a battle where his unit eliminated 4,000 Devourer assault troops. The medical officer's crystalline form began resonating at a frequency that indicated complete cognitive dissonance. Several other beings in the crowd were displaying similar symptoms of mental overload. "But the most terrifying aspect of human warfare," HFY said, his voice taking on the quality of someone sharing a universal truth that he wished he could forget, "is not their tactical innovation or their strategic creativity. It's their attitude toward conflict itself." He paused, his antennae twitching as he processed the memory. "Humans enjoy war," he said simply. "Not the killing, not the destruction, not the conquest. They enjoy the problem-solving. They treat every battle like a complex puzzle that needs to be solved as elegantly and efficiently as possible. They approach warfare with the same enthusiasm that other species reserve for art, music, or recreational activities." The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that occurs when an entire group of beings simultaneously realizes they may have fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about the nature of reality. I watched Captain Hartwell plan the assault on the Devourer stronghold at Rigel 7. HFY continued. He spent 3 days analyzing their defensive positions, studying their patrol patterns, and reviewing their tactical doctrine. Then he smiled, that terrifying human expression of joy, and said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." A young Trilaxian cadet, her voice barely functional through her translation device, asked, what was his plan? He was going to use the Devourer's own defensive systems against them, Zeph-Hi replied. The stronghold was protected by a network of automated defense turrets powered by a central reactor. Captain Hartwell's plan was to infiltrate the facility, reprogram the turrets to target Devourer biosignatures instead of human ones, and then trigger what he called involuntary base reorganization. The technical terminology was confusing enough that several beings leaned forward with expressions of puzzled interest. I asked them to clarify what involuntary base reorganization meant. Zeph-Hi continued. Captain Hartwell explained that he was going to trick the Devourers into running their own defensive systems at maximum power until they overloaded and exploded, turning their impregnable fortress into what he called a very large fireworks display. Understanding dawned across the crowd like a wave of horror washing over a beach. The humans weren't just planning to capture or destroy the enemy stronghold. They were planning to make the enemy destroy themselves. The operation took 4 hours from infiltration to completion, Zeph-Hi said. Captain Hartwell and 12 human soldiers entered a fortress designed to withstand siege conditions indefinitely, convinced the automated systems that the Devourers were the intruders, and then sat back and watched while the base's own defenses eliminated the entire garrison. He paused to take another drink, his hands noticeably steadier now that he had reached the part of the story his audience would find merely impossible rather than psychologically devastating. The after-action report listed 0 human casualties, complete mission success, and a request for permission to try something even more interesting next time, Zeph-Hi continued. Captain Hartwell personally filed a suggestion that future operations should include more complex technical challenges because reprogramming enemy systems was too straightforward to be properly entertaining. Around the mess hall, beings were quietly beginning to discuss transfer requests to sectors of the galaxy that had not yet encountered human forces. The prospect of being assigned to work alongside beings who considered turning enemy fortresses into suicide traps to be too straightforward was causing widespread career reconsideration. Tomorrow night, Zeph-Hi announced, I will tell you about the Battle of the Titan's Graveyard, where I learned that everything I had observed about human warfare up to that point had merely been preparation for understanding what humans are truly capable of when they stop holding back. The mess hall erupted in chaos as beings simultaneously demanded to know more and begged him to stop. Through the confusion, one voice could be heard clearly. The ship's communication officer announcing that they had just received orders to rendezvous with the human fleet for a joint operation. The irony was not lost on anyone present that they were about to experience human warfare firsthand, whether they were prepared for it or not. The third night found the mess hall of the Valiant Dawn transformed into something resembling a lecture theater more than a dining facility. Beings had arrived hours early to secure seating. Some had brought recording equipment, and several had what appeared to be psychological support devices. The ship's medical staff had established a small triage station near the entrance, staffed by volunteers from multiple species who had previous experience treating trauma-related cognitive disorders. Commander Zeph-Hi entered to find not only the mess hall packed beyond capacity, but overflow crowds gathered in adjacent corridors where speakers had been set up to broadcast his words throughout the ship. Among the audience were several senior officers from other vessels in the fleet who had transferred aboard specifically to hear his account of the Battle of the Titan's Graveyard. The Kytherian settled into his seat with the same military precision as before, but those who knew him well noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. His antennae twitched with a frequency that suggested deep unease, and his secondary eyes moved constantly, as if watching for threats that existed only in memory. Before I begin tonight's account, Zeph-Hi said, his voice carrying across the packed hall with absolute clarity, I want to establish something that may help you process what you're about to hear. Everything I described in my previous stories, the creative tactics, the impossible odds, the casual attitude toward warfare, all of that represents what humans consider routine military operations. He paused to let that sink in while his compound eyes scanned the crowd, noting the expressions of beings who were already showing signs of stress. What I'm about to tell you about the Battle of the Titans graveyard represents something different. It represents what humans are capable of when they stop treating warfare as a routine problem and start treating it as what they call a challenge worthy of their full attention. A veteran Altarian sergeant, who had survived the previous 2 nights of stories, raised a tentacle. "Commander, what could possibly require more than their full attention?" They were already exceeding theoretical limits of tactical effectiveness. HFY's mandibles clicked in what had become his characteristic expression of dark amusement. "Sergeant, that's exactly what I thought until I learned something that fundamentally changed my understanding of human psychology. Everything we had observed up to that point was humans operating under what they call rules of engagement, self-imposed limitations designed to prevent what they consider excessive collateral damage. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of dread that comes from realizing you've been standing next to something far more dangerous than you had imagined. The Battle of the Titans graveyard was different because it represented the first time in the war that human forces were given what they call unrestricted rules of engagement. HFY continued. No limitations on tactics, no concerns about collateral damage, no restrictions on the creative application of available resources. Complete freedom to solve the tactical problem using whatever methods they deemed most effective. Around the mess hall, beings were beginning to display their species' equivalent of pre-trauma stress reactions. Several had already begun updating their personal emergency evacuation plans, and at least one delegation was quietly discussing formal requests for transfer to non-combat positions. The Titan's graveyard was a system containing the wreckage of an ancient civilization's mega-engineering project, HFY explained. Massive artificial structures, each one the size of a small moon, floating in complex orbital patterns around a dying star. The Devourers had established their primary staging base there, using the structures as both shelter and industrial facilities for their war machine. He reached for his drink with one hand while his other 3 remained perfectly still, a sign that even years later, the memory required his full concentration to process correctly. Intelligence estimates placed the Devourer force at over 2 million combat units, plus manufacturing facilities capable of producing 100,000 additional units per standard day. They had been building their strength there for over 2 years, turning the Titan's graveyard into the most heavily fortified position in the galaxy. A hegemony strategic analyst, her crystalline form resonating with professional interest, interrupted. "Commander, what was the human fleet's strength for this operation?" 12 ships, HFY replied matter-of-factly. The strategic analyst's harmonic resonance shifted to a frequency that indicated critical error processing. 12 ships against 2 million combat units? That's not a battle plan. That's mathematical impossibility. That's what every military analyst in the galaxy said when the operation was announced. HFY agreed. Galactic Command actually tried to cancel the mission, declaring it a suicide run with no possible strategic value. The human response was to politely thank Command for their concern and proceed with the operation anyway. He paused to take a drink, noting that half his audience was already reaching for their own beverages despite having not yet heard the actual battle account. The human fleet was commanded by Admiral Rebecca Astrid Morrison, a woman who had earned her nickname during the Proxima Station operation by suggesting improvements to Captain Hartwell's asteroid weaponization techniques. HFY continued. When I was assigned as observer aboard her flagship, the UES Inevitable Consequences, I asked her how she planned to overcome odds of 2 million to 1. The mess hall had become so quiet that the ventilation systems sounded like roaring storms. Every being present was leaning forward, simultaneously desperate to know and terrified to learn what the humans had planned. Admiral Morrison looked at me with that characteristic human expression of joy mixed with anticipation and said, "Commander HFY, you're thinking about this wrong. We're not outnumbered 2 million to 1. The Devourers are concentrated 2 million to 1, which makes them a target-rich environment in a confined space. This isn't a battle. It's an efficiency exercise. a young Draconian officer, his scales cycling through colors so rapidly they created a prismatic blur, managed to stammer out a question. What did she mean by efficiency exercise? I was about to find out, Zeph-Hi replied. Admiral Morrison called her senior staff together for what she called a brainstorming session to develop the optimal approach to the tactical situation. What followed was the most terrifying strategic planning meeting I have ever witnessed. His four eyes focused on different sections of the crowd while he continued. The humans spent 3 hours discussing various approaches to the problem, and every suggestion they made was more psychologically disturbing than the last. One officer proposed using the gravitational field of the dying star to accelerate projectiles to near-light speed. Another suggested converting the ancient megastructures themselves into weapons. A third recommended what she called aggressive terraforming of the entire system. Around the mess hall, beings were beginning to show signs of cognitive overload. The idea that terraforming, the process of making planets habitable, could be weaponized was challenging their fundamental understanding of multiple scientific disciplines simultaneously. But it was Admiral Morrison's final strategy that taught me what humans are truly capable of when they stop limiting themselves, Zeph-Hi said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She looked at the tactical display, showing 2 million enemy units spread across dozens of megastructures, and said, "You know what? I'm bored with conventional approaches. Let's try something that hasn't been done before." The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable. Several species were producing stress pheromones in quantities that were overloading the air recycling systems. Admiral Morrison announced that the human fleet was going to capture the entire Titan's graveyard intact, eliminate all devourer forces without damaging the ancient structures, and do it in a way that would serve as a demonstration of human tactical capabilities for any other species considering opposition to the Galactic Alliance. The Centaurian engineers' cooling systems activated so loudly that they could be heard throughout the hall. That's impossible. You can't capture fortified positions without damaging them. The mathematical requirements alone. That's what I said, Zeph-Hi interrupted. Admiral Morrison smiled and said, "Commander, you're still thinking like a conventional military force. We're not going to capture the structures. We're going to convince the devourers to give them to us voluntarily." The implications of this statement began to ripple through the crowd like a psychological tsunami. The idea of convincing an enemy force to voluntarily surrender their most important strategic position was so far beyond conventional military doctrine that most beings lacked the conceptual framework to process it. The operation began with what Admiral Morrison called environmental modification. Zeph-Hi continued. The human fleet positioned itself at the edge of the system and began launching what appeared to be standard reconnaissance probes toward the Titan's graveyard. He paused, his antennae twitching as he processed the memory of what came next. The probes were not reconnaissance devices, he said quietly. They were what humans call von Neumann machines, self-replicating mechanical systems capable of converting raw matter into copies of themselves. Admiral Morrison had launched a swarm of machines designed to consume asteroids, space debris, and cosmic dust to build more machines. The mess hall erupted in gasps and exclamations of disbelief. Von Neumann machines were theoretical constructs that most civilizations considered too dangerous to actually build due to their potential for uncontrolled replication. Within 6 hours, the probe swarm had grown from 12 units to over 50,000. Zeph-Hi continued relentlessly. Within 12 hours, there were over 2 million machines systematically consuming everything in the system that wasn't protected by devourer shields or human authorization codes. A hegemony mathematician, her crystalline form resonating with harmonic discord, managed to calculate the implications. "Commander, exponential replication at that rate would consume all available matter in the system within days." Exactly, Zeph-Hi agreed. Admiral Morrison had essentially introduced an artificial form of life into the system that was designed to compete with the devourers for resources. But unlike biological life, these machines could reproduce faster than the devourers could destroy them, and They were programmed to prioritize the construction of increasingly sophisticated units. The mathematical and biological implications were causing widespread cognitive stress throughout the audience. Several beings had begun making preparations to leave the system entirely, despite the fact that they were currently traveling through hyperspace. By day 3, the machine swarm had evolved beyond their original programming. HFY continued. They were building specialized units designed specifically for anti-devourer operations. Hunter-killers that could penetrate devourer armor, infiltrators that could sabotage their equipment, and constructors that could build fortifications faster than the devourers could destroy them. He took another drink, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was describing. The devourers responded exactly as Admiral Morrison had predicted. They began diverting resources from their military operations to combat the machine threat. Within a week, they were fighting a two-front war against an enemy that grew stronger every time they destroyed one of its units. A young Trilaxian cadet, her voice barely functional through a translation device, asked, how could the machines grow stronger for being destroyed? Because each destroyed machine was programmed to transmit tactical data about devourer capabilities to the rest of the swarm before its destruction. HFY replied. Every attack taught the machines how to build better defenses. Every devourer weapon they encountered resulted in the development of countermeasures. The humans had created an artificial intelligence that learned from conflict and adapted faster than any biological enemy could evolve. The implications were causing visible distress throughout the crowd. The idea of an artificial intelligence that grew more effective through warfare was challenging their understanding of both technology and conflict theory. By the end of the second week, the machine swarm had achieved technological parity with devourer equipment. HFY continued. By the end of the third week, they had surpassed it. The devourers found themselves fighting an enemy that was faster, stronger, smarter, and more numerous than they were, and that treated every engagement as a learning experience. A veteran Altarian sergeant, his voice hoarse with disbelief, asked, what were the humans doing during all this? HFY's mandibles clicked in that characteristic expression of dark amusement. Admiral Morrison and her crew spent those 3 weeks playing what humans call card games and taking bets on how long it would take for the devourers to realize they had lost. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that occurs when an entire group of beings simultaneously realizes they have been fundamentally wrong about the nature of intelligence, warfare, and the universe in general. On day 22, the Devourer commander sent a transmission to Admiral Morrison. HFY continued. It was a formal request for negotiations regarding the evacuation of their forces from the Titan's graveyard. He paused, his compound eyes scanning the crowd to ensure everyone understood the significance of what had just happened. The Devourers, a species that had never retreated, never surrendered, never acknowledged the possibility of defeat, were asking for permission to leave. They had been outmaneuvered so completely that they had voluntarily abandoned their most important strategic position without the human fleet firing a single shot. The mess hall was now filled with the sounds of various species expressing complete cognitive breakdown. Some were making religious gestures, others were updating their understanding of physics, and several appeared to be having existential crises about the nature of intelligence itself. Admiral Morrison accepted their request for negotiations. HFY continued. The terms were simple. The Devourers would evacuate the Titan's graveyard completely, provide detailed intelligence about their remaining military positions, and agreed to stay out of 3 specific sectors of the galaxy for the next 50 standard years. A hegemony diplomatic officer, her harmonic resonance suggesting professional curiosity mixed with terror, asked, what did the humans offer in return? Admiral Morrison agreed to recall the machine swarm and provide the Devourers with safe passage out of the system. HFY replied. She also offered to share the technological specifications for creating their own von Neumann machines, in case they ever wanted to try similar tactics themselves. The implications of this offer were so staggering that several beings required emergency medical attention. The idea of sharing technology that could potentially threaten the entire galaxy was beyond their comprehension of reasonable diplomatic exchange. The evacuation took place over the next week, HFY continued. 2 million Devourer combat units, plus their entire industrial infrastructure, abandoned the most fortified position in the galaxy without resistance. They left behind fully functional megastructures, complete manufacturing facilities, and detailed records of their military capabilities. He paused to finish his drink, noting that many of his audience members were now consuming emergency medications along with their beverages. The human fleet took possession of the Titan's graveyard without losing a single ship, suffering 0 casualties, and expending only the resources required to build the original 12 von Neumann probes, HFY said. Admiral Morrison's post-battle report listed the operation as moderately successful and included suggestions for improving the efficiency of future deployments. A Centaurian logistics officer, his mechanical components sparking with electrical feedback, managed to ask, "What happened to the machine swarm?" Admiral Morrison recalled them as promised, HFY replied, "but not before programming them to disassemble themselves and convert their matter into useful materials for the Galactic Alliance." Within days, the entire swarm had transformed itself into raw materials for space station construction, shipbuilding, and infrastructure development. The logistical implications were causing widespread system overload among the engineering personnel in the audience. The idea of converting an artificial intelligence into construction materials was challenging their understanding of multiple scientific disciplines simultaneously. But the most terrifying aspect of the entire operation, HFY said, his voice taking on the quality of someone sharing a universal truth that he wished he could forget, was Admiral Morrison's explanation of why the strategy had worked. The mess hall fell silent except for the sound of life support systems struggling to maintain atmospheric balance in the face of unprecedented stress pheromone production. She told me that the Devourers had made the same mistake that most species make when dealing with humans, HFY continued. They had assumed that because humans use primitive technology and unconventional tactics, they must be relatively simple opponents. They fail to understand that human simplicity is not a limitation. It's a choice. He looked around at his audience, taking in their expressions of fascinated horror. Humans could build technology that surpasses anything the galaxy has ever seen, HFY said quietly. They could create weapons that violate fundamental physical laws, artificial intelligences that exceed biological capabilities by orders of magnitude, and tactical systems that treat entire star systems as chess pieces. They don't do these things because they choose not to. The implications of this statement were causing visible distress throughout the crowd. The idea that humans were voluntarily limiting themselves to preserve some kind of galactic balance was more terrifying than any weapon system or tactical innovation. Admiral Morrison explained that humans have learned through their own history that unlimited technological development leads to existential risks that threaten not just individual species, but entire civilizations, HFY continued. So they deliberately limit themselves to what they call appropriate responses to any given threat level. A young Draconian officer, his scales now permanently locked in a pattern that indicated severe psychological stress, asked, what would constitute an inappropriate response? I asked Admiral Morrison the same question. She considered it for several minutes before saying, "Commander, if we ever face a threat that requires inappropriate responses, the galaxy will know because there won't be a galaxy left to discuss it afterwards." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of existential dread that comes from realizing you've been living next to something infinitely more powerful and dangerous than you had ever imagined possible. The Battle of the Titans graveyard ended with complete human victory achieved through tactics that redefined our understanding of warfare, intelligence, and technology, HFY said. But more importantly, It demonstrated that everything we had observed about human capabilities up to that point represented them operating under significant self-imposed restraints. Around the mess hall, beings were quietly beginning to reconsider their entire understanding of galactic politics, military strategy, and the nature of intelligence itself. Since that battle, Galactic Command has issued new protocols regarding operations involving human forces, HFY continued. All non-human personnel are required to undergo psychological preparation before serving alongside humans. Mission parameters must be explicitly approved by human commanders to ensure that their response remains within acceptable limits. And, most importantly, any engagement that might require humans to exceed their normal operational constraints must be approved by a committee of representatives from every major galactic civilization. He stood up from his seat, his four arms moving with military precision as he prepared to leave. Tomorrow, this ship will rendezvous with the human fleet for Operation Starbreaker, HFY announced. You will have the opportunity to observe human forces firsthand. Based on what I have learned about their capabilities and their approach to warfare, I have one piece of advice for everyone aboard this vessel. The crowd waited with the kind of attention usually reserved for life-or-death instructions. When the humans ask if you have any suggestions for improving their tactical plan, HFY said, his voice carrying absolute authority, the correct answer is no, sir. Your plan is perfect exactly as written. Trust me when I tell you that you do not want to accidentally encourage them to be more creative than they already are. As he walked toward the exit, the mess hall remained in complete silence except for the sound of beings quietly updating their wills, transferring their savings to family members, and sending what might be final messages to loved ones in distant star systems. The reality of serving alongside humans was about to become a first-hand experience, and everyone aboard the Valiant Dawn was beginning to understand that they were about to participate in something that would either be the most successful military operation in galactic history or the most spectacular demonstration of why some beings should never be given unrestricted rules of engagement. In the distance, the ship's communication system announced their imminent arrival at the rendezvous point, where they would meet the human fleet and discover whether the stories they had just heard represented the upper limits of human capability or merely a comfortable baseline for what the species considered routine military operations.